Ambassador Rael Vasek of the Thin Hegemony was the first to notice, and he hated himself for not noticing sooner. He had walked into the Grand Assembly Hall of Meridian Prime the same way he had walked in for the past 40 years, with his chin raised, his forearms clasped behind his back, and his mind already sorting through the day's agenda, like a machine built for politics and nothing else. The hall was enormous, a cathedral of glass and light suspended in orbit above a dead moon, designed to hold delegations from over 4,000 spacefaring species. And on most days, it hummed with the noise of a galaxy trying to pretend it could govern itself. But today, something was wrong. Vasek could not name it at first, the way one might not immediately notice a missing tooth until the tongue searched for it, and then suddenly the absence was all one could feel. It was the human section, row 17, seats 41 through 60, a modest block near the back of the chamber, where the Terran dispersal had been assigned when they first joined the Concorde 600 years ago, and where they had remained ever since because no one had ever thought to move them closer. The seats were empty, not simply unoccupied the way seats sometimes were when a delegation was late or had chosen to skip a session, but truly empty, stripped bare of everything that had once marked them as belonging to anyone at all. The small flags were gone, the ones the humans had insisted on placing at the end of each row, little rectangles of blue and green that the other species had found childishly sentimental. The holographic nameplates were gone. The personal storage compartments beneath each seat had been cleared out. Even the thin layer of dust that gathered on unused surfaces in the station's recycled air was undisturbed, as though no one had sat in those chairs for a very long time. Vasek stared at the empty seats, felt something cold move through his chest. He turned to his aide, a young Finn officer named Dorith, and asked when the human delegation had last attended a session. Dorith checked the records and went very still. 32 standard days, he said, his voice careful and flat, in the way that junior officers spoke when they were delivering information they suspected their superior would not want to hear. No one had noticed for 32 days. Vasek wanted to be angry, wanted to find someone to blame for the oversight, but as he looked around the hall at the thousands of delegates settling into their places, he realized something worse. No one cared. The humans had been members of the Galactic Concorde for 6 centuries, and in all that time they had never been treated as anything more than a curiosity, a young species that had stumbled into the stars too early and refused to be quiet about it. They had no empire to speak of. Colonies and outposts they called the Terran dispersal, scattered across a modest stretch of the outer arm, like seeds thrown by a careless hand. They had no great fleets, no ancient culture, no claim to any of the mythic ages that the older species wore like crowns. What they had was enthusiasm, and the galaxy had found that exhausting. Vasek remembered the first time he had met a human diplomat, a woman named Chen something. He could never remember her family name because he had never considered it important enough to memorize. She had been young by human standards, barely into her middle years, and she had smiled at him with a warmth that made him deeply uncomfortable, because warmth was not a thing one expected from a stranger in the halls of power. She had talked about building a shared disaster response fleet, a permanent coalition that could deploy medical ships and engineering crews to any world in crisis, regardless of species or political affiliation. Alignment. Vasek had listened politely, and then voted against the proposal along with every other senior delegation. The humans had proposed similar ideas dozens of times over the centuries. Refugee accords, famine relief networks, shared scientific databases, weapons limitation treaties, universal translation standards, and every single time the proposals had been voted down or buried in committee or simply ignored until the humans stopped asking. And yet, they had kept coming back. Every session, every summit, every emergency meeting, the humans were there in their little block of seats near the back, raising their hands, submitting their proposals, trying to be heard by a galaxy that had decided long ago that they had nothing worth hearing. Vasek had never wondered why they kept trying. He had never wondered because he had never cared. Now the seats were empty, and the silence where their voices used to be felt like a wound he did not know he had been carrying. Over the following days, the reports came in slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a wall. Human embassies across the galaxy had been closed and sealed. Their staff departed without ceremony or explanation. Trade convoys that normally carried human goods along the outer shipping lanes and stopped running. Communication relays along the border of Terran space had gone dark, one by one, like candles being snuffed out in a long hallway. The humans had not declared war, had not issued threats, had not made demands. They had simply left. On the 35th day, a junior analyst named Surat, a small insectoid keth with compound eyes that missed very little and a mind that missed even less, pulled up the last message humanity had broadcast on open channels before the silence began. It had not been addressed to the Concord, not to any government or military body or head of state. It had been sent on a general frequency, open to anyone with a receiver and the willingness to listen. The message read, "To those we tried to help, we are sorry we could not do more, and to those who refused our hand, you will not see it offered again." Surat read it 3 times, and felt her antenna flatten against her skull in a gesture her species made when they sensed danger they could not yet see. She flagged the message as a potential security concern, and forwarded it to her department head, a Rathali bureaucrat named Talek, who had held his position for 90 years by making sure nothing interesting ever reached the people above him. Talek read the report, looked at Surat with the tired expression of someone who had long ago stopped believing that anything mattered, and deleted it. "They are humans," he said, as though that explained everything. "They will be back when they get lonely." Surat said nothing, but she saved a copy of the message on her personal device. That night, alone in her quarters, she read it again and again, until the words stopped being words and became something heavier, something that sat in her chest like a stone. She did not know what the humans were doing or where they had gone, but she knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent her life studying patterns, that the galaxy had just made a terrible mistake. 90 days after the last human voice vanished from the galactic channels, the cracks began to show. They did not appear where anyone expected, not along military borders or inside the halls of government, but in the quiet places, the overlooked corners of civilization where things simply worked and no one had ever stopped to ask why. The first sign came from the Loesi. The Loesi were a gentle species, soft-bodied and slow-moving, who had colonized a chain of humid jungle worlds along the galaxy's inner spiral, and they were dying. A respiratory plague had swept through their largest colony, a sickness they had faced before and beaten before, but this time the antiviral compounds they depended on were gone, and the medical database that held the formula was locked behind access codes that no Loesi doctor could break, because the antivirals had been designed by humans. 40 years earlier, a human medical team had spent 3 years on the Loesi homeworld studying their biology and developing treatments for the 6 most common diseases that killed their children. And they had done it for free, asking nothing in return except permission to publish the research in a shared database so that other species might benefit. The Loesi had accepted the help gratefully and then never thought about it again, the way one never thinks about the ground beneath one's feet until it opens up. Now the ground was gone. The medical database had been hosted on human servers, maintained by human technicians, and updated by human researchers. And when the humans withdrew, the servers went with them. Within weeks, 4,000 Loesi were dead, most of them young. The Dren were next. The Dren were farmers, a proud insular species who had turned their arid homeworld into a breadbasket, through sheer stubbornness, and an agricultural method they believed they had invented themselves. The soil enrichment technique that had transformed their deserts into fields had been quietly introduced by a human agronomist who had visited their world 2 centuries ago and spent a single season teaching their elders how to coax life from dead ground, and then had left without asking for credit or payment or even a thank you. The technique required a specific mineral supplement that the humans had been shipping to the Dren as part of a trade agreement, so minor that it did not even appear in official Concord records. The shipments had stopped. The Dren harvest failed. Across the outer territories, piracy surged along shipping lanes that had been patrolled by small human escort frigates, vessels so old and poorly armed that the major powers had laughed at them, but which had nonetheless kept the routes safe for decades through nothing more than presence and persistence. The frigates were gone now, and the pirates who had always been, watching and waiting, moved in like water filling an empty bowl. Refugee convoys that had once passed safely through human-protected corridors were seized, stripped, and left to drift. 12 species that depended on those trade routes for essential supplies began to starve. The Concord, faced with a crisis it had not predicted and could not explain, did what large institutions always do when confronted with evidence of their own failure. It formed a committee. The committee dispatched a scouting flotilla of 6 warships to the edges of former human space, led by a Rathali fleet commander named Orath, who considered the entire mission a waste of time, and said so loudly and often to anyone who would listen. What the flotilla found shut him up entirely. The human worlds were still there. The planets had not been abandoned or destroyed or evacuated, but they had been changed, surrounded by energy barriers of a kind that no Concord scientist could identify. Vast shimmering walls of force that wrapped around entire star systems like soap bubbles made of light. The barriers were beautiful, and that made them worse somehow, because beautiful things were not supposed to be frightening. Probes sent through the barriers did not come back, their signals cutting out the instant they crossed the threshold, as though they had simply ceased to exist. Long-range scanners, the most powerful instruments the Concord possessed, could detect the shapes of human infrastructure behind the barriers, stations, shipyards, communication arrays, orbital habitats, but everything had been moved, pulled inward and rearranged into configurations that made no strategic sense to any Concord military analyst. It was as though the humans had rebuilt their entire civilization from the inside out, while the galaxy was not watching. Commander Orath transmitted his findings back to the Concord with a recommendation that the barriers be treated as a defensive perimeter and left alone. The Finn hegemony did not agree. The hegemony was the galaxy's oldest and most powerful military empire, a species that had built its identity on the belief that strength was the only currency that mattered, and they did not like things they could not understand, because things they could not understand could not be controlled. They sent a battlecruiser, the Dominion's Fist, a vessel so massive that it had its own gravitational pull, through one of the barriers surrounding a minor human colony world. The ship passed through the barrier without resistance. 30 seconds later, it emerged from the other side. The hull was intact. Every system was functional. The engines were running, the weapons were charged, and the lights were on. The crew was gone. Every single Finn officer and soldier aboard the Dominion's Fist, all 840 of them, had vanished without leaving so much as a skin cell behind. There were no signs of weapons fire, no energy residue, no hull breaches, no evidence that anything violent had occurred at all. The crew had simply been removed, the way one might remove pieces from a game board, and the ship had been sent back empty, as though to say, we could have done worse, and we chose not to. Ambassador Rael Vasic received the report in his private quarters on Meridian Prime. He read it twice. Then he set down his datapad and stared at the wall for a very long time. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had survived 4 decades of galactic politics, which required a kind of courage that soldiers rarely understood. But he felt something now that he had not felt since he was a child, hearing stories about the dark spaces between stars. It was dread, pure and absolute, the kind that does not make you want to run, but instead makes you go very still, because some part of your brain has understood something that the rest of you is not ready to accept. The humans had not left because they were weak. They had left because they were strong enough to leave, and kind enough to leave quietly, and patient enough to wait for the galaxy to understand what it had lost. And the galaxy, Vasek realized with a sickness that settled into his bones like poison, was only just beginning to understand. 1 standard year after the humans vanished, the galaxy remembered how to hate. It had not taken long, Sarat thought, as she watched the war reports scroll across her screen in her cramped office deep inside Meridian Prime's administrative levels. A windowless room that smelled of recycled air and old coffee substitutes, and the particular despair of someone who had been right about something terrible and wished she had been wrong. The Thin hegemony and the Rithali communion had been circling each other like wounded animals for centuries, held apart not by respect or wisdom, but by a web of treaties and agreements and backroom deals that had somehow kept the peace long enough for everyone to forget how fragile peace actually was. That web was gone now. It had taken Sarat months of obsessive digging through Concord archives to understand why, months of sleepless nights and skipped meals, and the growing certainty that she was losing her mind or finding the truth. And she was no longer sure which was worse. The first treaty she examined was the Rithali Thin Non-Aggression Accord of 3412, the foundational document that had ended the last great war between the two powers and established the border zones that had held for 300 years. The accord had been proposed by the Rithali and ratified by the Thin, and that was what every history text said, and that was what every diplomat believed, and it was a lie. The original proposal had been drafted by a human diplomatic team working out of a tiny embassy on a station so small it did not even have a name, just a number. And they had spent 4 years quietly shuttling between the two capitals, carrying messages, suggesting compromises, absorbing insults from both sides, and slowly, painfully, thread by thread, stitching together an agreement that neither the Thin nor the Rithali would have reached on their own. When the accord was signed, the humans had not been invited to the ceremony. Sarat found the pattern repeated everywhere she looked, like a watermark hidden in paper that only becomes visible when held to the light. The Keth-Vorini Trade Pact, brokered by humans. The Outer Spiral Famine Relief Network, designed and funded by humans for its first 30 years, before other species took it over and forgot who had built it. The Universal Pathogen Early Warning System that had prevented at least 6 galaxy-wide pandemics, created by human epidemiologists who had donated the technology without conditions. The navigational charts through the Ashenma Nebula, a region of space so dangerous that it had been considered impassable until human explorer ships mapped safe corridors through it at the cost of 11 crews and over 200 lives, shared freely with every species in the Concord. Every time, the same story. The humans gave something, the galaxy took it, and no one said thank you, because no one thought the humans needed to be thanked. Humans mattered enough to thank. Sarat compiled her findings into a report so long and so detailed that it took 3 days just to format. And she included a summary page at the front, because she knew that politicians never read past the first page. And the summary said this: humanity was never a minor species. They were the invisible architecture of galactic civilization. And we have just ripped out the foundations of our own house, and are now surprised that the roof is caving in. She presented the report to the Concord Assembly on a day when the chamber was half empty, because a Thin border fleet had just destroyed a Rithali listening post, and everyone important was busy arguing about retaliation. The delegates who remained, listened to her with the polite disinterest that powerful people reserve for those they consider beneath them. And when she finished, the thin ambassador, a broad-shouldered career politician named Hesk, stood and called her findings sentimental hysteria about a failed species that lacked the strength to survive in a competitive galaxy. The chamber murmured in agreement. Surat stood at the podium and looked at the rows of faces, hundreds of species, thousands of years of accumulated wisdom and experience, and she felt something break inside her that she would never be able to repair, because she understood now that the problem was not ignorance. The problem was pride. They knew, some part of them had always known, that the humans had been carrying them, holding the pieces together with quiet hands and tired smiles, and an endless stubborn belief that the galaxy could be better than it was. And they had hated the humans for it, because no one likes to be reminded that they need help, especially not species that had built their identities on the myth of their own superiority. Surat left the chamber without speaking to anyone and returned to her office. 6 hours later, when the alarms began, 3 border relay networks had gone dark simultaneously, vast chains of communication stations that allowed real-time contact between star systems separated by hundreds of light-years. The relays had been gifts from humanity to the Concord, built and installed 2 centuries ago, and maintained ever since by automated systems running on human-designed software. Software that, as of 6 hours ago, had expired. Not crashed, not been hacked, not malfunctioned, but expired, like a subscription that had reached the end of its term, because somewhere buried in the code was a maintenance clause that required periodic renewal, and the only species that had the authorization to renew it was no longer answering calls. Within days, 18 more relay networks went dark. Communication across the galaxy, which had been instant and effortless for so long that no one remembered it being otherwise, became fractured, unreliable. War fleets lost contact with their command structures. Civilian shipping lanes fell into chaos. Emergency response systems that depended on real-time coordination went blind. The Concord scrambled to build replacements, but the human relay technology was centuries ahead of anything the other species could produce. And the engineers who tried to reverse engineer the systems found code so elegant and so complex that it would take decades to understand, let alone replicate. The humans had not just left. They had built a galaxy that could not function without them, and they had done it so gently and so gradually and so generously that no one had noticed until it was far too late. Surat sat alone in her dark office and listened to the alarms howling through the station and thought about a species that had spent 600 years trying to make the galaxy a better place, asking nothing in return, and had been answered with contempt. Thought about how long it must have taken them to decide to stop. She thought about how much it must have hurt. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like a knife between her ribs, that the galaxy had not lost a minor ally or a convenient servant. It had lost the only species that had ever loved it. And it had not deserved that love, not even once. 18 months after the departure, the galaxy burned. And it burned not because someone had set it on fire, but because no one was left to put the flames out. The thin Rathali War had spread the way wars always spread, not in straight lines, but in spirals, pulling in species that wanted nothing to do with the fighting, but could not avoid it, because neutrality requires borders that others are willing to respect, and respect was a currency that had lost all value. 12 species had joined the thin side, not out of loyalty, but out of fear, because the hegemony had made it clear that those who did not stand with them would be treated as those who stood against them. 9 species had joined the Rathali, for similar reasons. The rest huddled in the spaces between, trying to survive. Surat had stopped sleeping, or rather, she slept the way small prey animals sleep, in short, fitful bursts, with one eye open, and her antennae twitching at every sound. Meridian Prime was no longer the safe neutral ground it had once been, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before one side or the other decided to take it. She spent her waking hours in the Concord archives, which no one else visited anymore, because the Concord itself had become a ghost, its authority dissolved, its resolutions ignored, its grand chambers echoing and empty. But the archives still worked, and the archives held secrets, and Surratt had become very good at finding secrets. The latest collapse had been the translation systems. Every species in the galaxy spoke differently, thought differently, structured meaning in ways that were alien to one another, and the miracle of interspecies communication had always rested on a universal translation framework that converted not just words, but concepts, emotions, and contextual meaning across thousands of linguistic architectures simultaneously. The framework had been designed by human linguists. It had been maintained by human engineers, and it had been running on human servers that were now behind the barriers, silent and unreachable. The backup systems that the Concord had maintained were based on an older version of the framework, a version so simplified that it could handle basic trade negotiations and little else. And suddenly, species that had been speaking to each other fluently for centuries could barely understand one another. Misunderstandings multiplied, diplomatic messages were garbled, ceasefire negotiations collapsed, because neither side could trust that the other was saying what they meant. The war grew worse. Medical knowledge was the next to go. The shared medical databases that species relied on for cross-biology treatments, the protocols that allowed a Finn doctor to treat a Keth patient, or a Rafali surgeon to operate on a Luesi child, had been built on a foundation of human research so vast and so fundamental that removing it was like pulling the bottom card from a tower. Hospitals across the galaxy began turning away patients of other species because they no longer had the knowledge to help them safely. People died, not from weapons, but from ignorance, which was slower and more cruel. Then the navigational charts locked themselves. The Ashenmaw Nebula, the Vortigern Straits, the Pale Corridor, all the dangerous regions of space that human explorers had mapped at the cost of their own lives. The charts for all of them became encrypted behind codes that no one could break, and suddenly vast stretches of the galaxy became impassable walls of radiation and gravity and death. Trade routes that had carried food and medicine and raw materials for centuries were severed overnight. The galaxy was not just at war. It was being dismantled, taken apart piece by the absence of a species that had asked for nothing except to be allowed to help. Rael Vasek watched it all from a small apartment on Meridian Prime, a room he had rented with the last of his personal savings after the Thin hegemony had stripped him of his ambassadorship for the crime of suggesting, publicly and repeatedly, that the Concord should attempt to contact the humans and ask them to come back. He had been called a coward, a traitor, a human sympathizer, which in the current political climate was an accusation only slightly less dangerous than being called an enemy combatant. He did not care. He had spent 40 years caring about his career and his status and his position in the hierarchy of power, and all of it meant nothing now, less than nothing, because the hierarchy itself was collapsing, and the only question that mattered was whether anything could be saved from the wreckage. On a night when the station shook from a distant explosion that might have been a weapons test or might have been an attack, Vasek made a decision. Surratt, who he had met only once at her disastrous presentation to the Concord, and he told her he was going to the barriers around Earth's solar system, and he was going to beg. Surratt did not try to talk him out of it. She simply asked to come with him. They took a small civilian transport, an old ship held together by patches and stubbornness, and they flew for 11 days through space that had once been busy with traffic and was now empty and dark. When they reached the barrier surrounding the human home system, it was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. A wall of shimmering light that stretched in every direction, warm and golden like sunlight through honey. And Vasek had to remind himself that beautiful things could also be walls, could also be doors that only opened from one side. He sat at the communication console and broadcast a message in every human language stored in the ship's database, cycling through English and Mandarin, Arabic and Spanish and Hindi and dozens more, and in each language he said the same thing. He said he was sorry. He said the galaxy needed them. He said that he understood why they had left, and he could not blame them. But he was asking anyway, because asking was all he had left. He broadcast for 6 hours straight, until his voice gave out, and Surat took over, her translator struggling with the human languages, but her meaning clear. They waited. For 3 days they waited, orbiting the barrier in their tiny ship, sending their message into the golden light, and receiving nothing in return. On the 4th day, a response came. Not words, not a voice, not an invitation, but a single data packet, dense and precisely structured, that downloaded itself into their ship's computer before they could even decide whether to accept it. Surat opened it and went very still. It was a record, a complete and meticulously organized archive of every interaction humanity had ever had with the Galactic Concord. Every proposal submitted and rejected, every aid mission launched and ignored, every diplomatic insult delivered by a species that believed itself superior, every vote to restrict human expansion, every time a human diplomat had extended a hand and had it slapped away. Thousands of entries, spanning 600 years, each one documented with dates and names and the cold precision of a species that had been keeping count even when it pretended not to. At the very bottom of the file, below centuries of patience and rejection and quiet heartbreak, there was a single line of text. You were warned. You were given every chance. The silence is not our punishment. It is yours. Vasek read it and felt tears run down his face. Not because the message was cruel, but because every word of it was true. And truth, when it arrives too late to change anything, is the most painful thing in the universe. Surat. She looked back at him with her compound eyes, shining in a way he had never seen from a Keth. And he realized she was crying too, in whatever way her species cried, because grief is not owned by any one kind of creature. They sat together in their small ship, in front of that beautiful golden wall, and they mourned, not for what the galaxy had lost, but for what it had thrown away. 3 years after the silence began, the galaxy was a graveyard of empires that had believed themselves eternal. The Thin HFY War had ended not with a treaty or a surrender, but with exhaustion, the way a fire ends when there is nothing left to burn. Both powers emerged from the ashes so diminished that the word power no longer applied to either of them. The thin hegemony, which had once controlled a third of known space, had been reduced to its core systems, its mighty fleets scrapped for parts, its population hollow-eyed and hungry. The Rithali Communion had fared no better, its elegant crystal cities shattered, its famed academies closed, its people scattered across refugee camps in neutral space. 12 minor species had gone extinct during the conflict, not killed by weapons, but starved by the collapse of supply chains, and medical networks, and agricultural support systems that no one had maintained, because the only people who had ever maintained them were gone. Them were gone. The galaxy had not been conquered, it had simply fallen apart, the way a body falls apart when the heart stops beating, and no one knows how to restart it. Surat stood in the ruins of the Concord Assembly Hall, which had been damaged by a thin orbital strike 6 months earlier and never repaired. And she looked at the broken glass and twisted metal and thought about how quickly things that seem permanent can become wreckage. She had spent 3 years studying the human barriers, not with instruments and probes, because those had all failed, but with her mind, applying the pattern recognition skills that her species was known for to the largest pattern she had ever encountered. She had studied human history, every text and recording and document she could find in the archives, and she had read about their wars and their genocides and their cruelties, because the humans were not saints, and had never claimed to be. Their kindness, their stubborn, irrational, inexplicable kindness, the way they built hospitals in war zones, and fed strangers, and rushed toward disasters instead of away from them, and loved things that could not love them back. She had read about how they kept pets, creatures that served no practical purpose, and mourned them when they died. She had read about how they planted trees they would never sit under, and wrote letters to future generations they would never meet. And slowly, over months and years of study, she had come to understand something about the barriers that no amount of scanning or probing could have revealed. The barriers were not weapons. They were not defenses. They were not walls built to keep the galaxy out. They were walls built to keep the humans in. The humans had not withdrawn because they wanted to punish the galaxy. They had withdrawn because they could not stop themselves from helping. And the only way to stop helping, a galaxy that kept hurting them, for it was to make it physically impossible to reach that galaxy. The barriers were not a fortress. They were a cage, and the humans had locked themselves inside it, because they knew that if the door was open, they would walk through it, every single time, no matter how many times they had been turned away. The humans were not hiding behind those golden walls. They were grieving behind them. Surratt broadcast her theory on every open channel she could reach, her voice calm and steady and full of a sadness so deep that it did not need to be performed. And she said what she believed to be true, that humanity had not abandoned the galaxy, that humanity was trapped behind its own compassion, and that the silence was not anger, but heartbreak. For weeks, nothing happened. The galaxy was too busy mourning its own losses to care about the losses of a species it had never valued. And then, on a ruined Loesi colony world, the same world, where 4,000 people had died of a plague that human medicine could have cured, a small ship appeared. It was human in design, an old medical frigate with a patched hull and faded markings, and it descended through the atmosphere and landed on the outskirts of the largest remaining settlement without broadcasting any identification or requesting permission. A crew of 12 stepped out, men and women in worn medical uniforms carrying cases of supplies, and they set up a field hospital in a burned-out building and began treating the sick. They spoke to no one except their patients. They asked for nothing. When the work was done, 3 days later, they packed their equipment and left, and the ship rose into the sky and vanished. And the Loesi who had been treated stood in the doorways of the field hospital and watched it go and did not know what to say, because there are no words in any language for what they were feeling. Following months, more sightings were reported. A human engineering team appeared on a Dren farming world and repaired an atmospheric processor that had been broken for 2 years, working through the night without stopping, and then departed before dawn. A lone human pilot guided a refugee convoy through an uncharted nebula, threading a path between gravity wells and radiation storms with a skill that bordered on the impossible. And when the convoy reached safety, the pilot's ship turned around and flew back into the nebula and was gone. A human search and rescue team pulled survivors from a bombed-out Rathali space station, carrying broken bodies through wreckage with bare hands because their equipment had been damaged in the approach, and they saved 47 lives and left without giving their names. Each time the same pattern. The humans appeared, they helped, they left, they asked for nothing and said nothing and made no demands and carried no flags. They were not representatives of the Terran dispersal or agents of any government. They were just people who could not stand by while others suffered, even others who had treated them with contempt for 600 years. Rael Vasic, old now and tired in a way that went deeper than his bones, watched a news broadcast of the Rathali station rescue from a hospital bed on Meridian Prime, where he was being treated for a respiratory illness that would have been cured in minutes if human medical technology were still available. He looked at Surratt, who sat beside his bed the way she had sat beside him in the small ship in front of the Golden Barrier, a companion in grief, a fellow witness to the consequences of cruelty. "Why?" he asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. "After everything, after all of it, why would they come back?" Surat looked at the screen, where a human woman was carrying a Rithali child through the smoke and rubble of a station that the child's own people had helped destroy, and the woman's face was streaked with sweat and dust and blood, and she was smiling at the child, actually smiling, as though this act of senseless, stubborn kindness was the most natural thing in the world. "Because they cannot help it," Surat said, and her voice was quiet and full of wonder and breaking. "It is who they are. They will never stop reaching out, not even to those who slap their hand away, and that is what makes them terrifying. Not their weapons, not their silence, not their barriers, but the fact that no matter how much you hurt them, they will still try to save you." Vasek closed his eyes and let that truth settle into him like sunlight into cold ground. 1 month later, the remnants of the Galactic Concord gathered in the damaged assembly hall, delegates from 200 species standing among broken pillars and shattered glass, and they voted. It was the first unanimous vote in the history of the world. Concord. Every hand and claw and tentacle and appendage raised together without hesitation. Not a declaration of war, not a trade agreement, not a border resolution. A formal apology. The text was simple because the truth required no decoration, and it said that the Galactic Concord recognized that it had failed humanity in every way that mattered, that it had taken without giving, that it had mocked without listening, that it had broken the trust of the only species that had ever offered trust freely, and that it was sorry, truly and completely sorry, not because it wanted something in return, but because the apology was owed, and had been owed for a very long time. The transmission was sent toward the barriers around Earth's solar system on every frequency, in every language, with every ounce of power the damaged communication arrays could muster. There was no reply. Vasek, watching from his hospital bed, felt his heart sink. Assembly Hall, among the delegates, felt hers do the same. The galaxy waited in the silence it had created, and the silence stretched on, and hope, which is the most stubborn and most human of all emotions, began to fade. But the next morning, on Meridian Prime, a maintenance worker doing her rounds in the empty assembly hall stopped in the middle of the floor and stared. There, in row 17, seat 41, in the modest block near the back of the chamber where the Terran dispersal had sat for 600 years, a single chair had appeared. It was empty, but it was polished, and it was clean, and the small flag of blue and green that the other species had once found so childishly sentimental was placed at the end of the row, bright and patient and waiting. The maintenance worker did not know what it meant. But Surat, when she heard the news, did. It meant the door was open. It meant that somewhere behind a wall of golden light, a species that had every reason to stay silent was choosing, against all logic and all pain and all memory of what had been done to them, to listen. It meant that humanity was not done with the galaxy. It had never been done. Because that was the truth about humans, that the galaxy had taken 600 years, and a war, and a silence, and a breaking to learn. You could ignore them, and mock them, and reject them, and wound them, and turn your back on everything they offered, and they would still leave a chair for you at their table. They would still leave the light on. They would always, always leave the light on.